The wind always moved differently near the water. It carried a certain weight, a kind of quiet that you couldn't find anywhere else. Maya Brooks had lived by that lake for nearly 6 years now, long enough to feel like she understood its rhythms. The shift in the color of the light at dusk, the subtle gurgle of the shallows just before a storm, the distinct way sound traveled. Across the surface when the air was heavy with heat. Her house stood about 30 yards from the water, a modest but sharp-lined structure of the local wood and thick glass, built more for function than show. It wasn't her dream home. That had been sold off during the divorce. This one she had found through a foreclosure listing, and at the time it had felt like a compromise. But the dock had changed that. The dock her father had built decades ago still jutted into the water like a steady hand. She'd grown up fishing from it, sitting on its edge with dangling legs, hearing stories about how her grandfather once kept a small rowboat tied there in case the old generator gave out and they had to reach the other side. The dock was more than functional. It was historical, practical, and reliable, a word Maya found herself valuing more with each passing year. She had reinforced it herself, not as a statement of independence, though it certainly felt like one, but because no one else would. The pressure-treated wood had needed replacing in 2 places. The bolts had rusted through in others. She had drawn the measurements, consulted a few manuals, and paid a local contractor to help with the load-bearing calculations. She kept the documentation neatly organized in a labeled folder: dock permits, inspection approvals, insurance statements. It wasn't paranoia. It was just her way of navigating the world. Be prepared, so you don't have to be desperate. Especially now when climate change wasn't just a buzzword, especially here, where wildfires had become less of a rare emergency and more of a seasonal event. The fire department had used the dock multiple times already. Not for major fires, thankfully, but during drills, water sampling runs, and in one case to refill the tankers when a small cabin blaze flared up 3 miles north. The assistant fire chief had even thanked her personally last year, said if more lakeside owners had usable access points like hers, response times would be cut by minutes. Minutes could mean lives. He had looked her straight in the eye when he said that, and it wasn't performative. It wasn't political. It was practical. And Maya liked practical. That's why she maintained the clearing from the house to the dock, kept brush and invasive grasses low, paid for a secondary access path that ran from the roadside to the edge of her property. She wasn't naive. If something ever went wrong, no one was coming to help her in the first 10 minutes. You had to be your own first response in places like this. It wasn't that the neighborhood was remote in the traditional sense. You could reach the nearest highway in 12 minutes, a grocery store in 20. But there was a kind of deliberate insulation built into the design of the area. The lakefront community had been developed in the 1970s by a coalition of local investors who wanted something between luxury and privacy. Over time, that had morphed into regulation-heavy oversight from a cluster of committees, boards, and advisory panels, none of which Maya had ever cared to join. She wasn't social, but she wasn't hostile either. She waved when waved to, nodded politely when crossing paths, and politely declined when invited to neighborhood mixers and committee events. People accepted that about her. Or seemed to. The woman next door, Karen Underwood, had never quite come to terms with Maya's boundaries. Karen was the sort who brought muffins with her complaints. She had knocked on Maya's door the second week she moved in, welcoming her to the lake community with a wide grin and unsolicited stories about water pressure issues, raccoon deterrence, and how she'd once stopped a contractor from paving someone's driveway with the wrong aggregate. It wasn't immediately clear if Karen was offering friendship or control. Maya had smiled, thanked her for the muffins, and quietly shut the door the moment she left. Over the years, Karen continued to appear intermittently, often with a note about a community bulletin or a flyer about an upcoming vote. But Maya made it a point to remain civil, not close. What unsettled Maya was how many times Karen had asked about the dock. It started casually. "You don't really use it, do you?" and slowly evolved into more pointed comments about insurance liabilities, the aesthetics of the railing, and whether it was legal to maintain a private dock on shared waters. Maya had always answered plainly. The dock predated the majority of the properties on the lake, including Karen's. It was built on land registered to her father in 1982, and she had inherited it along with the house. It was not up for debate. Karen had nodded then, smiled, but something about her expression didn't sit right. Maya made a mental note of it and moved on. The fire season that year started early. There was a dry wind in May that had locals muttering about another 2018, and by June the ground was cracking. Maya cleared her gutters, trimmed back the hedges near the shed, and filled her emergency water barrels. She updated her go bag and tested the battery on the hand radio. She even walked the perimeter with a local forestry officer during a voluntary inspection and was told she was better prepared than half the town. It wasn't about fear, it was about readiness. Still, something in the air felt wrong. When she looked out over the lake at night, the trees no longer shimmered. They seemed to hold their breath. That morning, when she walked down to the dock with her coffee, as she had for years, she saw it. A new fence, steel, installed without warning. It ran straight across her land from one boundary line to the other, cutting off access to the dock entirely. No signage explained it. No warning had been posted. There was a padlock, new, polished, and bolted through an embedded post in the soil. Her land, her dock, blocked. She set her coffee on the ground and walked the length of the fence, checking for gaps, signs of entry, even a construction permit marker. Nothing. The dock was still there, glinting just past the bars, untouched but unreachable. It felt absurd. Then it felt insulting. Then it felt dangerous. Maya turned on her heel and marched back toward the house, hands already trembling. Not with panic, but with the unmistakable edge of calculation. Something had been done to her property, without consent, without notice, and under the guise of authority. She didn't know who ordered it or how they pulled it off so quickly, but she knew two things immediately. This wasn't a mistake, and it wasn't random. Later that day, after making a round of calls to the county property office, the regional water board, and the fire department, she had even fewer answers. None of the departments had issued any orders. No work permits had been filed. The only response she received was from a local advisory liaison, who vaguely referenced a temporary safety measure in coordination with recent environmental recommendations. When she asked what that meant in legal terms, there was silence, followed by a redirect to a different department. The chain of accountability dissolved into fog. Maya stood by the window that night watching the flicker of wind ripple across the surface of the water. The dock was barely visible now, lost behind metal and distance, like a memory she wasn't supposed to access anymore. It wasn't fear she felt. It wasn't even anger. It was the chilling realization that someone had chosen to cut off the one point of access to water that multiple emergency crews had called crucial. Someone had sealed it away without reason or review, and whoever had done it believed she wouldn't fight back. They were wrong. Maya didn't sleep that night. Not fully. Her body went through the motions. Lights off, doors locked, the usual rituals of shutting down for the evening. But her mind kept looping through every conversation, every document, every detail she could remember about the dock, the land, and the quiet war that seemed to have begun without so much as a knock. By morning, she had formed a plan. Not emotional, not reactionary, but deliberate. She called her attorney, Melissa Guerra, a calm, methodical woman with a talent for municipal code and a voice like polished granite. Melissa listened as Maya explained the situation from start to finish. The fence, the lack of notice, the unanswered calls, and the dock now sealed behind unauthorized steel. There was a pause, not a silence of confusion, but the pause of someone doing calculations in real time. Melissa asked for photos, parcel numbers, and a copy of the last land survey. Maya sent them within 10 minutes. 2 hours later, Melissa called back with her preliminary findings. The land in question is fully yours. There's no record of any easement, no ordinance allowing for temporary enclosures without notification, and no recent environmental emergency that would justify emergency seizure. In short, she said, this wasn't legal. It's either a mistake or it's something worse. Maya didn't like either option. She asked what the next step was. Melissa was already drafting a cease and desist notice, paired with a formal demand for explanation to be delivered to every relevant municipal office. But that would take days to process, and if the people responsible for the fence were hoping for that delay to buy time, they were succeeding. While Melissa handled the legal flank, Maya took the practical one. She walked the perimeter again, this time documenting everything, not just the fence but the disturbed soil near the posts, the pattern of tool marks suggesting multiple installers, and the fact that tire tracks still faintly curved through the lower portion of her property, indicating access by vehicle sometime during the previous 48 hours. She took photos of the padlock, the hinges, even the anchoring brackets. All of it bespoke speed and calculation. Whoever did this had planned it well, but not well enough to erase the evidence. She forwarded all of it to Melissa, who confirmed it would strengthen the claim of unauthorized modification of private land. But evidence didn't undo damage. It didn't unlock her dock. It didn't return access to the fire crews who might soon need it. That afternoon, Maya called Captain Nolan, a man who, until now, had never raised his voice in her presence, and explained the situation. When she described the barricade, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then his voice dropped into something low, flat, and angry. "You're telling me they locked you out of your own dock?" "The same dock we used last spring during the brush fire on Saddle Creek," she confirmed. Another pause. "We have an operational map that designates that dock as our primary refill point for the lower basin. That wasn't a courtesy. That was a formal designation. No one's allowed to interfere with that without notifying us. Not the city. Not the county. Not a local committee with a clipboard and a god complex." Maya asked if he could put that in writing. He told her she didn't need it in writing. He was coming to see it himself. An hour later, a fire truck pulled up outside Maya's house. Not a small vehicle, not a subtle show of concern. A full apparatus. 3 crew members stepped out with Nolan, all of them in uniform, all of them stone-faced. Nolan walked the fence line, examined the construction, took his own photos, and muttered under his breath the whole time. He shook the fence once, tested the lock, then turned to Maya with an expression that made her stomach knot. "If there's a fire on this side of the lake," he said, "we're blind. We'd have to go a quarter-mile up the road to the next access point, and that one's unreliable during high draw. You know what that means?" She nodded, but he said it anyway. "It means 3 extra minutes. 3 minutes of open flame." Maya asked what she could do in the meantime. Nolan said he'd file an operational obstruction notice through his department, which could lead to an emergency override. But that could take days unless escalated through city channels. He looked up at her house, then at the still lake behind the fence. "You've got something here that works, and they just sabotaged it for no reason." By evening, word had begun to spread. Not publicly, not virally. This wasn't the kind of neighborhood that aired its conflicts on Facebook, but in the subtle ways that people talk when they're nervous. Maya noticed a few neighbors walking slower near her property line, not stopping but glancing longer than usual. One even waved, though they hadn't spoken in months. It was the kind of behavior that came not from gossip, but from awareness. An awareness that something serious had happened, and everyone was waiting to see who would blink first. The next day, an anonymous letter appeared in her mailbox. No envelope, no name, typed on printer paper with a clipped tone. "There's a reason we try to keep things orderly here. Private docks set bad precedents. This is about the whole lake, not just your piece of it." Maya read it twice, then shredded it and threw it in the compost. But the words clung to her. They weren't just invasive, they were deliberate. Someone had taken the time to tell her, in a veiled way, that this wasn't personal, it was systemic. A decision made behind closed doors by people who believed in systems over individual rights. And the worst part, there was no clear face to confront, no one to drag into the open and demand answers from. On the third day, Melissa called with a troubling update. One of the departments they had served papers to, the Land Use Committee, claimed that a temporary shoreline regulation had been invoked under subsection B17 of the environmental zoning provision. Maya had never heard of that subsection. Neither had Melissa. But the committee claimed it granted them discretionary authority to erect temporary barriers on properties adjoining sensitive water access zones during peak environmental risk periods. Maya asked how a dock used by firefighters could be considered environmentally risky. Melissa was already filing a challenge, but the phrasing of the regulation suggested something even more concerning. It wasn't written with environmental safety in mind. It was written to give bureaucratic cover to arbitrary actions, all under the illusion of collective good. That same day, a new sign was mounted on the fence. It read, "Temporary Restricted Access. Lakefront Zone 4. No contact info. No agency named. Just sterile, impersonal font on reflective laminate." Maya stood in her driveway that evening, staring at the sign, feeling the weight of it press against her chest. Not because she was afraid, but because it confirmed what she'd suspected. This wasn't just about her dock. It was about precedent. Someone wanted to control who had access to water, to emergency routes, to visibility. It didn't matter that she had followed every rule, secured every permit, done everything by the book. In fact, that probably made her more of a target, because she had proved it could be done. That you could be a private homeowner, responsible and prepared, and still support the broader community without needing oversight, interference, or permission. And that, in their minds, was the problem. She didn't say a word to anyone as she went back inside. She didn't rage, didn't cry. She sat at her desk, opened a new folder, and labeled it Zone 4 Conflict. Inside, she placed copies of every letter, photo, map, and response. She knew this wasn't over. But it was no longer about just getting the fence removed. It was about proving that power didn't come from who shouted the loudest or who hid behind faceless bureaucracy. It came from the people who refused to be silenced, no matter how many locks they put on what was already theirs. The following week blurred into a series of controlled tasks and long silences, the kind that creep into a house when the routines of ordinary life are replaced by sustained confrontation. Maya was not new to conflict, but this one had a peculiar quality. Its aggressor was nowhere and everywhere at once. There was no one to argue with directly, no face across a desk to point at, no single name to blame. The fence remained solid and locked, and the new signage changed from a laminated notice to something more permanent. A steel-etched plaque bolted onto the center post, bearing the same message about restricted access to Lakefront Zone 4. The typography was municipal standard, the bolts rust-resistant, and the border was powder-coated in city blue. Whoever installed it had done so with the confidence of someone who didn't expect to be challenged, and that confidence made Maya's hands shake, not with fear, but with the deep, methodical pressure that builds when you know someone is betting you'll give up. Melissa filed the formal challenge against subsection B17 the same day the plaque went up. She also submitted a supplemental petition to halt all activity related to the fence, citing a violation of multiple land use ordinances and a lack of procedural transparency. But Maya knew the wheels of city bureaucracy turned slowly. That's why, instead of waiting for the next procedural reply, she drove to the County Environmental Records Office herself. The building was low-slung and gray, wedged between two larger administrative complexes, and its lobby smelled faintly of paper and bleach. She requested all public documentation related to the formation and invocation of subsection B17. The clerk, a middle-aged man with a tired expression and a badge that read Ronnie, asked her to wait while he checked the archives. 30 minutes later, he returned with a single folder, thin and poorly labeled. Inside were 6 pages, a vague proposal drafted 5 years earlier by a former environmental coordinator, a single approval note signed by an interim board, and a partial email string referencing concerns about unauthorized dock construction. In Zones 3 and 4, Maya's name did not appear anywhere. Her dock was not unauthorized, and yet this flimsy stack of papers had become the legal scaffold supporting the restriction of her property and the sabotage of emergency access to a critical water source. Ronnie apologized with a shrug and said, "Sometimes they push this stuff through fast. No hearings, just internal sign-offs." Maya thanked him, scanned every page with the office copier, and left with a copy of the trail she was now determined to dismantle. That night, the air was sharp and dry, and the stars hung low over the lake like small, brittle warnings. Maya walked to the edge of the fence and leaned against the cold metal, staring through it at the dock. The moonlight traced a perfect reflection across the surface, broken only by the movement of wind through distant reeds. She didn't hear the footsteps until they were within 20 feet. She turned and saw Karen standing at the corner of the property line, arms crossed, her mouth tilted into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I heard you've been busy," she said, voice light but edged with something sharper. Maya didn't reply. Karen took another step forward. "You know, the lake doesn't belong to any one of us. It belongs to all of us. These private little installations, they divide the community." Maya's reply was calm, quiet. "My installation is fully permitted. It predates your house. It's listed in the fire department's response plan. It has nothing to do with community division. It's about function and safety." Karen's smile widened, but her eyes narrowed. "And yet it's always you, acting like the rules don't apply. Some of us still believe in structure." Maya didn't raise her voice, didn't step back. "Structure is fine. Manipulation is not." Karen's expression soured just slightly. "Be careful, Maya. Not everything can be solved with paperwork." Then she turned and walked away, her silhouette swallowed by the trees. Maya stood there for a long time after, not because she was unsettled by the threat, but because it confirmed something she had only suspected until now. Karen wasn't just an agitator, she was a participant. 3 days later, Maya's property was inspected without warning. 2 city officials in plain windbreakers knocked on her door mid-morning, brandishing clipboards and polite explanations. "Routine compliance check," they said. "Environmental assessments post-drought." Maya asked for the inspection order. They couldn't provide it. She asked which department had sent them. They offered a vague mention of Environmental Review Board, then began walking the perimeter with handheld scanners. One of them took photos of her solar panel wiring. The other documented the incline of her driveway. When she pressed again for identification, they produced laminated credentials that looked hastily assembled. She made note of the badge numbers. After they left, she called Melissa, who cross-referenced the IDs with the official employee database. Neither name matched. The review board had not issued any inspections that week. Maya had just been visited by 2 men impersonating city officials. She filed a report, both with the sheriff's department and the municipal fraud division. No one followed up. That evening, her garden was vandalized. Not entirely, nothing broken, nothing stolen, but all the irrigation timers had been unscrewed, their settings erased. The vegetable beds were trampled in tight, circular paths, as if someone had walked repeatedly through them just to leave a trace. No cameras had caught it. The damage was subtle but specific. It was meant to say, "We're watching." Maya cleaned the mess in silence. She didn't call the police. She knew they wouldn't find anyone. Instead, she reinstalled the timers, reseeded the soil, and reinforced her property line with low-mounted floodlights. A week passed with no response from the committee overseeing subsection B17. Melissa escalated the matter to a superior court filing, while Maya returned to the fire station to meet with Nolan. He had copies of their own documentation now, including satellite maps and hydrant distribution charts. He confirmed that, without access to the dock, the southern lakefront was officially listed as Delayed Access Zone. Maya asked what that meant during a fire. He said it meant triage. It meant choices. It meant someone's home would burn while another's was saved. Maya didn't speak for a long time after that. The turning point came quietly. One morning, she awoke to find a new object installed beside the plaque on the fence. A keypad. Digital. Weatherproof. Wired to the lock. There was no notice, no code provided. When she called the local zoning office, they claimed ignorance. Melissa sent a demand for access disclosure under the state property statute. No reply. Nolan submitted an official inquiry through his department. No reply. It was clear now. Someone was actively escalating. Not only had they blocked access to her dock, but they had begun turning that blockade into a permanent, tech-reinforced restriction, one that no local fire crew, inspector, or legal claim could bypass without a numerical code no one had been given. This wasn't about safety. It was about control. And someone, somewhere, had decided that Maya's dock, her access, her independence, her refusal to fold, had to be neutralized. That night, Maya opened her old field notebook. She drew a rough map of her property, marked every known utility line, and listed the recent changes she could confirm. Fence installed without permit. Signage modified with permanent materials. Surveillance-style inspection by imposters. Garden tampered with. Keypad installed without authority. She didn't make any accusations. She simply recorded facts. Because facts were how you won. Not noise, not threats, not panic, just facts. She dated the page. She closed the book. Then she set it beside her emergency radio in the folder marked Zone 4 Conflict. The air was dry that night. Dry and quiet. Too quiet. The lake didn't move. The wind didn't shift. But something was building, and Maya knew exactly what to do when it finally broke. The smell of smoke arrived before the sound. It wasn't thick or overwhelming, not at first, just a faint, acrid thread curling through the open windows like an afterthought, almost easy to ignore if not for the dryness in the air that had lingered all week. Maya caught it just past midnight while walking through her hallway. She paused near the kitchen and inhaled again. It was there. Not the smokiness of a nearby grill or the distant scent of burning wood that sometimes drifted from cabins across the lake, but the sharp, restless, chemically tinged warning that something large was on fire and moving fast. She turned off all the lights except for the porch lamp, stepped outside barefoot, and listened. The wind was wrong. It pushed south to north, whipping across the surface of the lake in restless, uneven gusts. That alone made her stomach tighten. She remembered what Nolan had said about triage and delayed zones. She went back inside and grabbed her go bag, double-checked the emergency radio frequency, and then stood by the window with her eyes fixed on the hills across the water. Within 20 minutes, she could see the glow, subtle at first, like a candle flickering behind curtains, then growing, stretching upward like it was inhaling the night. She didn't panic. She moved. She suited up in fire-resistant gear she'd bought during the 2019 scare, loaded her documents, laptop, and the external drives into her car, parked it facing outward, and set the radio volume to low, tuned to the county emergency band. By 2:17 a.m., the first evacuation alert reached her phone, a Level 1 warning for zones west of the lake. She was on the south side, not included yet, but she knew how fast these warnings escalated. What mattered now was staying alert and keeping the dock ready in case the fire department made it to her side and needed water access. She flipped the breaker to the pump line at the base of her property and opened the emergency flow valve that had been installed specifically for rapid refill. Then she moved to the fence and stared through the metal toward the dock. The moon was high and full, illuminating the surface with unnatural clarity. But the dock remained inaccessible. The keypad blinked red, steady and unbothered, as if mocking her preparations. The padlock still hung from its bracket, dull and silent. She could already imagine the firefighting unit arriving, seconds ticking, realizing they couldn't deploy, having to reverse course for another site, all because of this absurd wall. She tried the emergency number Nolan had given her. No answer. Too much chaos. She texted him the code. Fence blocking dock. Access needed. Unlock now. No reply. Cell towers were likely overwhelmed. Sirens began in the distance, many of them. Not just one truck, but multiple vehicles. A rolling, overlapping scream that twisted through the darkness like a blade. Maya climbed to her roof and scanned the ridge beyond the tree line with her binoculars. The flames were no longer distant. They licked over the horizon like dancers rising from the earth. No two the same. She watched a line of headlights moving up the fire road to the northwest. Then, finally, she saw them. 2 fire engines pulling down the old service path parallel to the lake, their floodlights bouncing wildly across the underbrush as they cut through the dry grass. Relief flooded her chest until she saw where they stopped, 20 yards short of the gate. They got out, approached the fence, flashlights sweeping, hands gesturing. They couldn't get through. Maya sprinted down the slope, yelling as she approached. "The valve's live! The dock's safe! You just need the lock off!" One of the men turned and shouted over the rising wind, "We can't cut it without permission. We'll get nailed on property damage. Do you have keys?" She shook her head furiously. "It was installed illegally. No one has access, not even the department." Another firefighter joined in, trying combinations on the keypad, but it buzzed with each attempt, flashing that same useless red. The wind howled behind them, and another crew member radioed something urgently, voice crackling, unintelligible. Then came the words Maya dreaded. "Pull out. Command says fall back to Zone 3. She shouted again, begged them to override, but the order had come down. Liability, jurisdiction, safety, protocol. They packed up fast, and within 3 minutes their trucks were gone, swallowed into the darkness, their lights bouncing against the trees as they retreated to the north line. Maya stood at the fence, her breath visible in sharp puffs, fists clenched at her sides, and then, within 30 minutes, the sky turned orange. The wind carried sparks like knives. Ember rain began to fall. Slow, deliberate, each piece glowing red before snuffing out on gravel or wood. She soaked her house's perimeter with a hose until the line went dry. Her own water supply had been rerouted to the dock valve, now useless behind steel. She retreated into her home, sealed the windows, turned on the air recirculation fan, and waited. Hours passed. Sirens faded. The sky outside never returned to black. It stayed that strange artificial dusk of flame until sunrise, when the worst of it had moved through. Then came the smoke, thick, choking, layered with the scent of everything that should never burn. Treated lumber, plastic siding, vinyl curtains, insulation. When Maya stepped outside that morning, her mouth covered, her eyes watering, she saw the damage. Not her house. Her property had been spared, partially because of wind, partially because of her prep. But 5 homes to the west, 2 to the south, and, most shocking, Karen's were gone. Blackened rectangles of ash and twisted metal. No signs of activity, just the strange, awful stillness that comes after the flames have fed enough. She sat down on the gravel near the gate, stared through the bars at the dock she had maintained so carefully for so many years. And for the first time since this began, she let the emotion come. Not tears, but a deep, low, breathless ache, the kind that lives somewhere behind the ribs and tightens with each thought. People had lost everything. Not because there wasn't water, but because the gate had been locked, because someone had decided access was a risk, because the idea of authority had outweighed the need for common sense. Later that day, Nolan called. His voice was rough and full of unsaid things. "We tried," he said. "We really did. But we couldn't cut the fence, not with the new code lock. County would have had our heads. And I didn't know. No one told me they changed it again. We're filing a full incident report. It won't be pretty." Maya asked how many homes were lost. 9 confirmed. 1 injury. No fatalities. Then, after a pause, he added, "But we could have done better, and they're going to know that." The report he promised arrived in her inbox 3 days later, along with an official statement declaring that restricted access to an emergency use dock directly contributed to delayed response during active fire containment operations. The wording was bureaucratic, but the implication was clear. Maya printed it out, 3 copies, 1 for her files, 1 for Melissa, and 1 to send, certified mail, to the same office that had invoked subsection B17. The cost was already paid. The fire had made sure of that. But now, finally, there would be a reckoning. The days following the fire blurred together in a haze of smoke, ash, insurance agents, displaced neighbors, and silent accusations that drifted through the air like dust. Maya remained in her home, which now stood like a lone survivor surrounded by charred earth and scorched outlines where porches and fences once framed other lives. Her lawn, though blackened at the edges, remained intact. Her house, though thick with the odor of burned pine and melted plastic, was structurally unharmed. Her dock, visible beyond the stubborn barricade, was untouched by flame but soaked in failure. It had been there, ready, the very tool they needed to save lives and property, and it had been rendered useless by bureaucracy masquerading as order. The report from the fire department confirmed what everyone already suspected but hadn't yet said out loud. The delayed access had cost valuable time, and those lost minutes could not be undone. Maya thought about Karen, whose lot now resembled an ancient ruin, and felt no satisfaction. Just a sickening, lead-heavy numbness. It didn't have to end this way. But someone had decided it would. Melissa moved quickly, filing a lawsuit for unlawful obstruction of emergency access and property restriction without due process. The county clerk assigned the case a number that Maya now repeated like a mantra. 475-8, ZC 21. She didn't expect it to deliver justice. She expected resistance. And she got it. Within 72 hours of the lawsuit filing, she received an official notice from the Lakefront Planning Coalition, an organization she had never interacted with directly, informing her that her property was now under review for compliance with revised shoreline preservation guidelines. The language was intentionally vague, but the implication was clear. They were escalating, not backing off, not apologizing. They were coming after her again, not through physical barricades this time, but through the coded, sterilized language of regulatory retaliation. At Melissa's urging, Maya began compiling a complete record of every interaction, every communication, every procedural flaw dating back to the fence installation. They discovered that several of the signatories behind the subsection B17 enforcement were not current board members but advisory contributors, a term with no legal standing under city zoning protocol. Even more damning, at least one of them, Ronald H. Devlin, had signed under a title he hadn't held in over a year. Melissa filed a motion to force the withdrawal of all B17-based restrictions on her land, pending an audit of the individuals and procedures used to enforce it. It was a bold move, one designed to expose the rot at the center of the process. But boldness invited counterattack. The very next day, Maya received a complaint from Animal Control regarding unlicensed livestock observed on the premises. She didn't own livestock. She owned one dog, an aging shepherd mix named Jasper, who rarely left the shade of her porch. The officer sent to investigate was sheepish and polite, clearly embarrassed. He left after 10 minutes, issuing no citation. But it wasn't about animals. It was about pressure. The pressure didn't stop. 2 mornings later, she discovered a yellow tag nailed to a tree at the edge of her property. Water usage review pending. See case W932C. When she called the office listed, They claimed no such tag had been issued. Melissa traced the case number. It didn't exist. The tag had been manufactured, printed with a fake code, and placed in a visible spot to unnerve her. That evening, a drone flew low over her backyard for several minutes, hovering, spinning slowly, blinking as it recorded. She called it in. The sheriff's deputy said drones were not illegal over private property unless proven to be harassing. "Is it threatening you directly?" he asked. She said no. He said to call back if it returned. It did. Twice more that week. Maya installed motion-activated floodlights and began keeping a log of every time the drone appeared, including photos and timestamps. Melissa included the pattern in the ongoing harassment documentation for the case. Meanwhile, Melissa had uncovered something even more alarming. The enforcement of the subsection B17 had been facilitated through a software platform licensed to a private consulting firm named Stratum Civic Solutions. Stratum wasn't a public entity. It was a third-party contractor retained to assist in urban compliance and community optimization through algorithmic flagging of potential violations. The fence order had not originated from a human complaint but from a software flag triggered by Maya's property profile, specifically the satellite-recorded footprint of her dock and the proximity to the lake edge. Melissa was stunned. They used software to justify a physical blockade, then backfilled the paperwork with fake oversight. Maya's stomach turned. It wasn't Karen alone. It wasn't a board or a neighborly dispute. It was a system, flawed, unregulated, designed to protect no one but itself. And someone had allowed it to take root in her county. The legal team prepared a subpoena for internal communications between the planning coalition and Stratum. In response, Maya received a cease and desist letter accusing her of interfering with ongoing regulatory review. It was signed by a name she hadn't seen before, Dane Whitlock, special advisor to the coalition director. A quick search revealed that Dane had once worked for Stratum as a policy strategist. The circle was tightening. The foxes were guarding the henhouse. Maya had been turned into an example, not because she broke rules, but because she challenged them, exposed them, and dared to expect accountability. That night, Maya stood at the edge of the fence again. The lock had been changed once more. The keypad no longer blinked. It was inert, sealed, a monument to obstruction. Beyond it, the dock stood quiet and dark, the lake like black glass beneath it. A shift had occurred in her mind. She no longer cared about neighborhood politics. She no longer wanted to be left alone. She wanted the system that enabled this cruelty, not just to her, but to the neighbors whose homes had been sacrificed to procedure, to be dragged into daylight and dissected piece by piece. She wrote a statement, not for social media, not for the press, but for court. Clear, factual, devastating. She listed the fire, the timeline, the documented delays, the agency silence, the procedural fraud, and the retaliatory harassment. She signed it. Melissa called it evidentiary gold. 2 days later, a city council liaison reached out requesting a community dialogue to discuss shoreline usage norms and reduce tensions. Maya declined, not out of spite but because she had no interest in smoothing things over. Not while the structure that enabled such a gross failure still stood. She wanted more than a seat at the table. She wanted the table dismantled and rebuilt on real accountability. Behind the scenes, Nolan and his department were preparing to deliver their own internal report to the mayor's office, complete with footage from helmet cams during the fire response. Melissa hinted that when the footage reached the city's legal division, settlement discussions would likely begin, because no one wanted that kind of visual evidence going public. But Maya wasn't interested in settlements either. Not yet. She wanted the truth established, not buried under hush money and quietly issued corrections. She wanted the fence removed, the codes invalidated, the policy revoked, and the software disbanded. She wanted her dock restored to its rightful designation, not just a private structure, but an essential part of the community's emergency infrastructure. She wanted a map, a clause, a signed declaration saying so. Only then would she consider terms. Until then, the pressure would continue, and she would match it, document for document, action for action, quietly, strategically, unrelentingly. Because if they were going to escalate, so was she, and they had no idea just how far she was willing to go. By the time the City Council convened an emergency oversight session to address the mounting complaints and formal challenges surrounding shoreline access enforcement, the atmosphere was less of curiosity and more of controlled panic. Behind closed doors, liability had already been calculated. The cost of rebuilding 9 homes, the weight of firefighter testimony, and the steady stream of documentation from Maya and Melissa had formed a picture that no PR spin could erase. Every agency, board, and private contractor remotely tied to subsection B17 was now in quiet retreat, either preparing statements of non-involvement or working double time to cleanse digital traces of their participation. Maya had no access to those meetings, but she didn't need it. She saw the ripples. Calls from reporters to the city offices suddenly redirected to pending legal consultation. Emails returned with canned language about policy reevaluation. And most telling of all, the silence from Dane Whitlock, who had, until 2 weeks ago, been the most aggressive mouthpiece for the coalition's defense. Now he was absent, unavailable, his name conspicuously missing from correspondence. Melissa confirmed that internal personnel records indicated he had been placed on indefinite leave pending internal audit. It wasn't a resignation. It was containment. Damage control had begun. Maya's court date had been scheduled for mid-month, but the city moved first. In a letter signed by the Deputy Director of Emergency Infrastructure Policy, she received formal notification that all enforcements related to subsection B17 were to be suspended, and that, pending the outcome of legal review, no further restrictions shall be applied to water-adjacent private structures previously designated as compliant with County Fire Service cooperation standards. It was a partial concession. No apology, no direct reversal, just a temporary lifting of restrictions. But it meant one thing: they were blinking first. The lock was removed within 24 hours. Not by apology, not with ceremony, just gone. Maya walked out one morning and found the keypad hanging open, deactivated, the steel fence door slightly ajar. No note, no explanation, just absence. She stepped through the opening slowly, almost disbelieving, and placed her hand on the wooden rail of the dock. The boards were sun-bleached, warm under the morning light, untouched by fire, exactly as she had left them. Except now they felt reclaimed. Not returned, not gifted, reclaimed. But she didn't stop there. The lawsuit remained active, and Melissa had pivoted from obstruction to policy dismantlement. They no longer needed to prove harm. That was done. Now they were showing the mechanism of it, the trail of procedural abuse, the software triggers, the conflict of interest between advisory board members and private contractors. The subpoena to Stratum Civic Solutions had gone through. They were forced to turn over internal communications, and what emerged painted a damning picture. Property profiles tagged for non-cooperative potential were flagged through a proprietary risk matrix, a vague algorithm tied not just to zoning data, but to owner compliance history. Maya had been flagged not for violations, but for what Stratum called low regulatory engagement. In other words, because she hadn't participated in local committees, hadn't attended planning meetings, and hadn't subscribed to the neighborhood community portal, she was deemed a long-term perimeter anomaly. It wasn't illegal, but it was enough for the software to suggest action. Someone on the coalition had simply greenlit it. No names were attached to the final authorization, just a timestamp. Melissa knew what that meant: plausible deniability built into the system itself. The fire department's internal review was made public the same day Maya's case was scheduled for hearing. It included helmet cam footage from the night of the fire, showing the team reaching the fence, attempting to override the lock, and ultimately retreating under orders. The footage was raw and undeniable. Flames visible in the background, the sense of urgency palpable, the decision to abandon the dock echoing through the body cam microphones like an admission of defeat. It aired once on a local affiliate station, then spread rapidly through civic watchdog channels and infrastructure forums. Maya didn't watch it more than once. She didn't need to. The fire had already burned through more than property. It had incinerated the illusion that these decisions were made for the common good. People were beginning to understand that their safety had been reduced to data points on a privately managed dashboard. When the judge presiding over her case read the compiled findings aloud, even the city attorney offered no counter-argument. There was a pause in the courtroom, not dramatic, just weighty. And then the judge issued an order. The policy under subsection B17 was to be voided, and any future enforcement tied to it required direct approval through a public hearing and formal board vote. It didn't erase the fire. It didn't replace what had been lost, but it re-established a boundary between governance and shadow management. The fence would never go back up. The policy could never be quietly invoked again. And for the first time in months, Maya felt stillness. Not the tense, anxious kind, but a quiet, rooted in finality. Back at her home, the view hadn't changed. Trees were still bare and blackened, the air still carried the faint memory of combustion, and construction crews had begun clearing lots where homes used to stand. Karen's lot had been leveled, the remains hauled away, and a realtor's sign stood at its edge with bold font advertising, "Prime Lakeside Opportunity. Build anew." Maya stared at it for a moment, then turned back toward her house. She didn't want vengeance. She didn't want power. She wanted the order that was promised by the system she had followed her whole life to mean something. And now, maybe, it did. That evening, she walked out to the dock for the first time in weeks. The sun was setting in streaks of deep crimson and copper, reflected perfectly in the still water. She stood at the edge, hands on the railing, and for the first time, she allowed herself to breathe. Really breathe. Not in anticipation, not in preparation, just in acknowledgement. The wind moved differently near the water, and now, finally, it moved freely again. The summer that followed was quiet in ways that felt unfamiliar, not because there was peace exactly, but because the noise had changed. There were no more unsigned notices, no more drones circling above the roofline, no new codes bolted to fences. The silence that settled around Maya's property was not one of indifference, but of withdrawal, a strategic retreat by those who had once moved with such aggressive certainty. The structure that had enabled them, that had told them they were untouchable, had cracked. No headlines declared it. No citywide announcement rang out. But within the bureaucratic corridors and dusty boardrooms where decisions were once made without oversight, a quiet panic had begun. They had miscalculated. They had underestimated what one person with preparation, patience, and a long memory could do and pushed to the edge. They had not expected Maya to stand not just for herself, but for the principle that property lines were not just legal designations, but promises of responsibility. And in times of crisis, those who honored those responsibilities should not be punished, but protected. The legal victory had been significant, but it had not made Maya a local hero. That was never her goal, and the neighborhood remained cautious around her. Some greeted her with polite distance, others avoided eye contact altogether. Rebuilding efforts were underway, and the lot where Karen's house had stood remained empty longer than the others. Rumors circulated that the insurance company had denied full coverage due to prior non-disclosure of unapproved property modifications, likely a result of the gate installation never being filed officially. Maya didn't ask. She didn't need to know. That story had ended. Karen had moved out of state, quietly and without public comment. Whether she left in shame, defiance, or something more complicated, Maya didn't speculate. The dock was open now. The gate was gone. The access point reinstated in the emergency network. These facts were enough. Melissa offered to pursue further damages, but Maya declined. Money wasn't the point. The files had been sealed into the court record. The policy had been dismantled. The pattern of abuse had been mapped, archived, and exposed. What mattered was that it could not be repeated. Not like this, not in the shadows, not without someone somewhere remembering what had happened when control went unchecked. The fire department sent her a framed letter of acknowledgement. Not quite an apology, but close. It thanked her for her preparedness, her documentation, her insistence. It stated, in clear terms, that the dock would remain an active part of the department's response protocol. Maya hung the letter in the entryway. Not for guests, not for conversation, but because sometimes it matters that someone, somewhere, put something in writing that can't be erased. Weeks passed. Then months. The lake slowly returned to something like normal, though the tree line bore permanent scars. Maya planted fire-resistant shrubs along the southern perimeter and replaced the old storage shed with a steel-frame structure reinforced against heat. She met with a small group of property owners who had begun to organize for more transparent oversight, this time with legal observers and open documentation. She didn't join the group, but lent them copies of her filings. "Don't let them bait you into being the loudest voice," she told one of them. "Be the one with records. Be the one with dates." Her words weren't dramatic. They were procedural. But the man she spoke to nodded with quiet resolve. Maya could see in him the beginning of something. Not a movement, not a rebellion, but an awakening. These people had learned the hard way that obedience did not equal protection. As autumn approached, and the air shifted again with that pre-winter bite that came early in the hills, Maya took to walking the dock in the evenings. The boards creaked slightly underfoot, weathered but strong. The new brass fixtures installed by the fire crew shimmered faintly under moonlight. There was a hook installed now, a quick tether system that allowed for faster hose attachment in emergencies. It wasn't visible from the road, and no one had made a speech when it was put in. But it was there. Quiet, permanent, functional. Maya touched it every time she passed. It wasn't reverence. It was confirmation. This place worked. It had always worked. And it had nearly been destroyed because someone found that threatening. She never fully relaxed. That wasn't who she was. But she no longer moved from a place of reaction. She had plans again, not defenses. There was talk of developing the undeveloped southern ridge into new homes, and Maya had already pulled the topography maps to see how that would affect emergency access points. She wasn't looking for a fight, but if one came, she would be ready, not just for herself, but for those who might not be able to document every lie, every delay, every flicker of coercion dressed up as compliance. One morning, as frost edged the dock rails and the sun split the lake into scattered reflections, Maya stood at the end of the platform and watched a fireboat idle briefly on the water, then drift slowly toward the center before disappearing behind the bend. No sirens, no emergency, just a routine patrol, a presence, a quiet kind of readiness. And for the first time since the fence had gone up, since the air turned orange and the dock stood useless behind steel, Maya allowed herself to feel it. Relief. Not because the system had been corrected, but because she had forced it to admit, just once, that it had gone too far, that someone was watching, that someone was willing to remember.